I'm Pat Keon, a Senior Research Analyst with Lipper, and I'm here to speak to you about fund flows activity for the week ended Wednesday, January 2nd. We'll start this week's report by taking a quick look at the market activity for the week. The major indices recovered some of their monthly losses last week. It was a volatile week of trading, due in part to the light holiday trading volume, as well as global growth concerns and the still unresolved partial shutdown of the U.S. government. For the week, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, the S&P 500 Index, and the NASDAQ Composite Index recorded gains of 2%, 1.7%, and 1.7% respectively. Let's turn our attention back now to the fund flows activity for the week. We'll start by taking a quick look at our macro groups. Equity mutual funds saw $16.9 billion leave last week. Taxable bond funds, also big net outflows here. They have $15.5 billion leave their coffers. Muni bond funds, net outflows were a little more muted at $706 million, while money market funds, as you would think in these uncertain times, had net inflows for the week. They took in about $6.1 billion in net new money. We'll now take a closer look at each one of the fund asset groups, starting with equity funds. Equity mutual funds, as we mentioned, saw just about $17 billion leave their coffers. It was the 28th straight week of net outflows for the group. Net outflows came from both the domestic and the non-domestic side this week. Domestic equity funds saw $9.5 billion leave, and non-domestic equity funds saw $7.4 billion leave. Taking a little bit more granular look, we see equity income. That peer group was responsible for net outflows of $1.2 billion, and international large cap growth funds saw $1.1 billion leave. We'll move on now, look at our equity ETF group. This group actually had net inflows last week. Net outflows is here again last week. They saw $1.8 billion leave. The major contributor to this net outflow was the SPDR S&P 500, which had about $8.4 billion leave their coffers. Contributing to the total net outflow was Invesco QQQ, had about $3 billion in net outflows, and on the flip side, we saw iShares Core S&P 500 product with net inflows of just around $1 billion. We'll move on now, start looking at our taxable bond groups. Taxable bond mutual funds, net outflows here last week, $15.5 billion. Investors were fleeing the below investment grade debt products as loan participation funds or bank loan funds saw net outflows of $2.1 billion, and high yield funds saw net outflows of $1.2 billion. Taxable bond ETFs, this group had net inflows last week. They took in $2.8 billion in net new money. Major contributors, individual contributors, was the iShares iBox dollar high yield corporate product, net inflows of $972 million, followed by the iShares short-term treasury bond product, which had net inflows of $816 million. On the flip side, for net outflows, we see the Velocity Shares 3x inverse natural gas product with net outflows of $241 million. Our next asset group to take a look at is Muni Debt funds. This group had net outflows last week as well. They saw just over $700 million leave their coffers. The largest peer groups contributing to these net outflows was the Intermediate Muni Debt Fund peer group and the General Muni Fund group, which had net outflows of $453 million and $228 million respectively. Our last asset group to take a look at is money market funds. As mentioned earlier, this group took in net new money last week, about $6.1 billion. The largest net inflows for the week belong to U.S. government money market funds and money market instrument funds, which took in $10 billion and $6.2 billion respectively. And the largest net outflow belonged to institutional U.S. government money market funds, which saw just short of $12 billion leave their coffers. That concludes this week's report. If you'd like to take a closer look at the data for yourself, please go to our website. It's www.lipperusfundflows.com. And please join us here again next week, where another one of our analysts will be speaking about that week's fund flows activity.